Hello, everyone. Just going to give everyone 1 minute to join before we get started. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar on the environmental impacts of the invasion of Ukraine. I'm Madison Calhoun, Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. I'll be giving some brief opening remarks and introducing all of the panelists before turning things over to our moderator, Carl. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a fantastic group of panelists here to analyze the conflict. I want to take a second to thank all of them for their time and preparation for this webinar. We are so appreciative of their efforts. Another big thanks to our co-sponsors, the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and the Conflict and Environment Observatory. The format of today's event will be, I will introduce everyone, and then Carl will lead the panelists as they each give a short overview of their perspectives on the invasion of Ukraine, followed by a roundtable discussion. There will be time at the end for questions, so please submit your questions in the questions box on Zoom. You can submit them as soon as you think of them, so there's no need to wait until the end. With that, I'll go ahead and give brief introductions of everyone. Please look at the event page on ELI's website to find the links to everyone's full biographies. First, our moderator today is Carl Bruck. Carl is a senior attorney at the director of international programs at ELI. Carl's research focuses on making environmental law work. He has helped countries across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia develop and implement laws and policies and institutional frameworks to effectively manage water resources, biodiversity, forests, and other natural resources. He is an authority on the means to manage natural resources to support post-conflict peace building, on environmental governance and institutions, and on ways to prevent, reduce, mitigate, and compensate for damage to the environment during armed conflict. In addition to working at ELI, Carl has been an attorney with the United Nations Environment Program and the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide. He's an adjunct professor with American University's School of International Service, where he teaches a master's level course on environmental peace building. Thank you so much for moderating today, Carl. Our first panelist is Dr. Stavros Pantosopoulos. Stavros is a postdoctoral researcher with the Toxic Crimes Project at the University of Helsinki and a researcher with the Astor Institute. He is a founding member of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and the chair of its law interest group. Stavros served as a research assistant to the International Law Commission, former Special Rapporteur, Ambassador Marie Jacobson in 2015 in the context of its work on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, and he will be assisting Special Rapporteur Ambassador Marja Leto during this year's session. His research focuses on the legal aspects of environmental protection during and after armed conflict. Thank you so much for being here. Our second panelist is Professor Simi Payne. Simi is a member of the Rutgers University faculty. She has appeared as a counsel before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in its deep seabed mining and fisheries advisory opinion cases, and as expert on environmental reparations in the International Court of Justice case Certain Activities, Costa Rica v. Nicaragua. She participated as counsel for the United Nations Compensation Commission in a reparations process for environmental damage due to armed conflict and in the creation of a related environmental award follow-up program to ensure that awards were used to restore environmental harm. Our third panelist is Damon Watson. Damon is an attorney and member of ELI. He formerly served as an Emerging Leaders Initiative member and is now on the Leadership Council. He is a Chicago area environmental justice advocate with the NAACP Chicago Southside branch. He studied international relations at Morehouse College and served in the United States Army, where he commissioned as an officer through the United States Army Infantry Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. He received his chemical branch qualification through Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, where he studied weapons of mass destruction, defensive strategies. As a chemical officer, Damon served as a platoon leader running chemical reconnaissance teams and served as a subject matter expert and advisor on senior military staff, particularly where environmental contamination and weaponized chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear events affected military operations. He further earned several certifications in hazardous materials response, urban search and rescue, and incident command through the Department of Defense, Alabama Fire College, and FEMA in order to coordinate primarily chemical reconnaissance and secondarily mass casualty decontamination operations in the event of a terrorist, CBRN, and toxic industrial chemical events throughout the United States as part of the state, local, and federal integrated incident command system. Thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least is our final panelist, Doug Weir. Doug is the Research and Policy Director at the Conflict and Environment Observatory and has undertaken research and advocacy on the polluting legacy of armed conflicts and military activities since 2005. After working on conflict pollution and the toxic remnants of war, and for many years, he established the Conflict and Environment Observatory to monitor and raise awareness of the environment and derived humanitarian consequences of conflicts. For the past decade, his work has had a particular focus on the International Law Commission's study on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts. Thank you so much to all of our fantastic panelists. I will now turn things over to you, Carl, to get us started with this event. Thank you again.
Thank you, Madison, and welcome all. The format for today will start with a brief tour de table. Each speaker will have about 5 minutes to make some opening remarks. I'll have a few prepared questions to the panel, and then we will open it up for comments, questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom to pose your questions. And I'd like to start with Doug. Doug, in particular, you've been tracking and documenting a lot of the impacts. Wondering what have you been finding?
Thanks for the introduction, Carl. Hi, everybody. And also thanks for the opportunity for Conflict Environment Observatory to partner with ELI and the Environmental Peacebuilding Association for this event. So I'll provide a very brief overview of the environmental dimensions of the invasion of Ukraine, as we've seen, just to kind of set the tone for discussion, really. So top level, what we're witnessing is a high intensity international armed conflict in a highly industrialized country. Much of Ukraine's industrial infrastructure is located within or in close proximity to urban areas that have been the subject of intense and often indiscriminate bombardment by Russia. This has created a heightened risk of serious air, water and soil pollution, and in certain places, the risk of environmental emergencies associated with environmentally hazardous infrastructure. Where feasible, some industrial enterprises have taken preventative measures to reduce the risks. In some respects, this mirrors the experience of the last 8 years and the fighting in the intensely industrialized eastern Donbass region. We've already seen a great deal of damage to military, industrial, energy and commercial sites and civilian infrastructure, which has the potential to harm the environment. The severe damage we've seen to urban areas from Russia's siege tactics and the use of explosive weapons is generating a massive legacy of debris management, the disposal of which will create environmental problems unless it's properly managed, while obviously rebuilding, which will be a huge undertaking, will require significant national resources and also generate significant emissions. The astonishing activities of Russian forces at 2 of Ukraine's nuclear sites at Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia have really highlighted both the direct and indirect risks that conflicts pose in countries with nuclear energy infrastructure. Ukraine has 15 reactors in country, but it's also sort of shown up the weakness of the international institutions and norms that are intended to prevent them. It's not something we were expecting to have to respond to or deal with in many ways. Domestically, we've seen the conflict has reoriented national environmental governance away from its daily activities towards tracking and accounting for damage, and also towards immediate preventative actions or response actions. Across the country, we've seen monitoring systems which were pretty well developed for both air quality and radiation have been disrupted, gone offline in some cases. They're slowly beginning to come back on, thanks to the support of civil society. We've also seen emergency domestic legislation passed by the Ukrainian parliament, stripping the need for environmental impact assessments during post-conflict recovery, and also allowing the expansion of agricultural land into non-farmed land. And this may have ramifications for the environment. Many from Ukrainian environmental civil society have been displaced, but then over the last few weeks, we've seen sort of rebuilding and also reorienting towards advocacy, but also towards data collection and providing data to the government in its efforts to track environmental damage. Protected areas and nature parks have also been affected by the fighting, maybe less than we might have seen so far because of the focus of the fighting on urban areas and towns and villages, but we've seen fighting and also them being rendered inaccessible to staff, which has implications for their management. Agricultural lands we've seen have been very heavily impacted by mines and unexploded ordnance, together with cratering and likely shrapnel. We've also seen several agricultural facilities, such as grain elevators, directly targeted. Control over access to water supplies to Crimea clearly informed Russian strategy in the south during the first 48 hours of the invasion, and that'll invariably be an important factor in whatever peace agreement or frozen conflict eventually follows when it comes to Crimea and Kherson Oblast down in the south. Littoral and naval warfare in the Black Sea has created pollution risks from damaged shipping. It's also raised concerns over sensitive coastal habitats and seen the use of landmines in a defensive manner along beaches along the Black Sea coast. The conflict's already had a major impact on global environmental governance, its influence of UN Environment Assembly. It's been flagged during negotiations of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but then determining its influence on global greenhouse gas emissions and also climate change mitigation will be complex, as this area is somewhat understudied. And finally, the conflict's focus, with it now shifting to the heavily industrialized Donbass region in the east, the spectre of industrial accidents remains ever present, with further damage in the area like to overlay that already caused by 8 years of conflict in the area, including that from the unmanaged closure of coal mines. I think that concludes my roundup.
My old nemesis, the mute button. Sorry about that. I'd like to turn now to Stavros. Stavros, you've been doing a lot of work, as was noted with the ILC, and looking at the broad legal framework that governs protection of the environment, not just during, but in relation to armed conflict more broadly. Wondering if you could share a few words on that.
Many thanks, Carl. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor and pleasure to be among these panelists. So yeah, in this preliminary initial remarks I will be providing, I just want to focus on a couple of broad themes, and then perhaps we can further detail them in the Q&A or in our ensuing discussion. The first point I would like to raise is that the law of interstate conflict, the law of international armed conflict, as we usually refer to it, still remains relevant. In recent decades or in recent times, especially after the 2000s, there has been a considerable surge of non-international armed conflicts, civil wars, for example, and then some people were questioning the relevance of the law of international armed conflict. We see in these very tragic terms that the law of international armed conflict still retains its relevance, and in one respect, this can be useful in the sense that the law of international armed conflict is more developed than the law of non-international armed conflict. And this would provide more tools, more legal tools when attempting to remedy environmental damage, for example. This is the first point, and it is connected to the second one, that we can also see the relevance of the law of occupation. And it is true that environmental protection, when it comes to situations of occupation, is not well developed. Nevertheless, recent legal initiatives undertaken, for example, by the International Law Commission, you mentioned earlier, Carl, or the International Committee of the Red Cross, have touched upon these issues, environmental protection situations of occupation, and we can employ these legal tools in our effort to remedy environmental damage. Of course, we can speak more. We can elaborate on these initiatives later on, and on their detailed provisions. So my first point was about the relevance of the more developed law of interstate conflict, which offers more possibilities in this effort. It is connected to the second point about the law of occupation. And now I would also like to make a point in connection with what Doug said, that now we can see the new possibilities again, that new technologies offer to us, and these have been exploited and used very constructively by civil society organizations writ large, and of course also other actors beyond states. And this commendable work that these organizations are doing can provide the basis, the evidentiary basis upon which we can bring legal claims, and we can explore more legal avenues. And now I would like to move to my fourth and final initial remark, that we see precisely because of these new technologies, that more international organizations are involved or are rapidly responding to this conflict with missions. For example, recently the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe published a report and considered that the conflict is still ongoing. In other conflicts, we had to wait until the at least on the ground cessation of hostilities, but not nowadays. We see that all these tools can be used by the international community, broadly speaking, to document potential violations. And of course, this will enable a faster remediation of environmental damage and potentially compensation to victims that have suffered from environmental damage. So just to sum it up, the first was about the relevance of the law of interstate conflict as far as environmental damage is concerned, including the law of occupation, where the Russian Federation is still occupying territories, parts of Ukrainian territory. Then it's about the interplay and collaboration between civil society and the international community, generally speaking, as far as documenting violations pertaining to environmental damage. And my last point was about this concerted effort, in a sense, of the international community to bring the perpetrators to justice.
Thank you, Stavros. And we'll turn next to Damon Watson, who has a very interesting combination of experience, both as an Army officer and dealing with pollution in the context of military operations, but also from an environmental justice perspective. Before I turn over, I do want to encourage people to continue posting questions in the Q&A section here. There are a couple already there. Damon, the floor is yours.
Sure. One of the things that I find most interesting about this topic is that it basically presents a real-time scenario that created the career that I have now. That is, again, as a chemical officer, having served with the Army, and looking at some of the effects of chemical weapons and how they move, how they impact different units and so forth. And then, as well as that, looking at how it impacts people directly here in the United States, not just in terms of chemical weapons, but other forms of pollution as well. And so when I look at this situation, there's a lot of overlap between what's going on overseas in Ukraine, environmentally speaking, a lot of overlap in terms of what's happening there and what's happening here. So just as we talk about, say, some of the weapons detonations or the destruction of some of your industrial facilities, the environmental impact of that is chemically pretty much the same as the danger that you would see within the United States if there was, say, an explosion for whatever industrial reason, and how that would impact people. And where environmental justice tends to come in is when that tends to be concentrated among a certain group of people based on siting and placement. And so where I'm coming from here is trying to take more of that Andrew Young kind of nuance, where I take the concepts of environmental justice, which is derivative of the civil rights movement, but then also to internationalize that concept and show how some of the EJ principles that apply here apply over there. And then as we move from there, figure out exactly how we can go about enforcing certain environmental principles as in places like the Environmental Criminal Court and so forth. So again, it's about how we link all of this so that we can better conceptualize what's going on there and here, because I tend to see that most people don't see the connection between the environmental impacts in a military situation versus environmental impacts here. And so now this is our opportunity to show people that yes, the national security concerns and our environmental concerns are in fact hand in hand. And so this is among our first opportunities to really show that to the public at large.
Amen. And I'd like to turn now to Simi Payne, who has the distinction of having served as an attorney with the UN Compensation Commission, actually trying to evaluate claims related to the 1990-91 Iraq invasion of Kuwait. And Simi, very much welcome your perspectives here, having actually tried to, and to some large measure, hold a country accountable for environmental damage from armed conflict.
Well, Carl, it feels like I'm coming full circle here, because my first contact with the UN Compensation Commission was at the reception that you held at the beginning of your work in this project to celebrate the book that ELI produced on the topic. And it's a sad area for us to both be specialized in, but to the extent that we can be helpful, good to have the skill. So yeah, interestingly, the work that I've done has been largely at the end of the process in practice. Years later, 10 years after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, we began working on environmental damage claims, and it took us about 5 years to get through them. So it was quite a while before compensation actually reached the injured environment. But that provides, I think, two important issues. One is accountability for the damage, and the other is the opportunity to clean up afterwards, to restore and repair to the extent possible. Carl has been known to refer to the Pottery Barn rule. You break something and you're responsible for it. And the other thing we know about that is it's never the same afterwards. So just to quickly run through some of the background on how what we've learned about reparations might apply in this situation, and what we need to be mindful of now, even though the conflict is still ongoing. We have to, for Ukraine's long-term future, ensure that environmental damage is addressed in a timely way and with appropriate standards. Reparations will be needed to restore safe drinking water, soil that can be used for agriculture, restoration of culturally important landscapes in Ukraine, including the wetlands of international importance and World Heritage sites that Doug referenced. In the past, international law didn't recognize harm to the environment, and now it does. But it's useful to look to the past to understand the scope of harm and its persistence. One of the things we learned from the ordnance expert we worked with at the UN Compensation Commission was that he was also working on European battlefields from World War I that are still deadly. Reports of both the UN Compensation Commission Awards Program, which ended up awarding over $5 billion for the relatively low-key conflict with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. It was nothing like, it was a rapid invasion and nothing like the damage that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine currently, nor is it on the scale, because Ukraine is a large country and there's a very large area that's being affected. But you can look at that and get a sense of what the kind of damage could be, which will flesh out a little bit what Doug was describing. And I think also what Doug mentioned, particularly about the Black Sea, is that this damage is going to go beyond Ukraine itself. There'll be other countries involved. There's two branches of international law that we can turn to, criminal and civil. And there's been a lot of discussion in the newspapers and various media about using the International Criminal Court. From my point of view, where my focus is on getting the environment as restored as possible and returning it to the Ukrainian people, while criminal law is appealing because it provides for punishment, so a strong form of accountability and a sense of justice, perhaps, it's challenging, and reparations in international criminal tribunals have been limited and have not included environmental damage. I don't want to say that it's impossible, and I think nothing should be taken off the table, but I think there's better alternatives. I wanted to mention that a proposal to reform the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute, the statute that creates the court, to add a crime of ecocide was raised last year. And so the intent of that project was to extend the reach of the Rome Statute's article on protection of the environment to peacetime. So while that's normatively expressive to talk about ecocide, I think it's not applicable in this context. And it's not adopted in any case as an international crime. The current case at the International Court of Justice is based on violations of certain kinds of claims of violations of the Genocide Convention. For various reasons, it's unlikely to result in awards of extensive reparations needed, particularly for the environmental damage. So I think the final alternative is the use of a civil liability basis. It's a legal, where the legal basis is various treaty violations, including, of course, primarily the violation of the UN Charter prohibition on illegal war. But other conventions as well, and conventions drawing from international environmental law. And the doctrine of state responsibility says that when a state violates its international obligations, it has an obligation to provide reparations. And those reparations can be restitution, actually coming in and cleaning up and fixing up. I think it's unlikely Ukraine's going to want Russia to come and help it clean up. But financial compensation is an option. And that was the way the UN Compensation Commission was structured. The consequence of cleaning up this damage will be in the hundreds of billions of dollars, including all the kinds of claims that will, in some senses, have priority of killing and torturing, raping people, as well as all the infrastructure and the civilian things. So it's important, I think it's particularly important, this webinar, to make sure that environment stays on the agenda, because that's going to be necessary to restore the country and return it. There's some things about sources of compensation and procedures that might be used, but I think I'll leave that, I'll tease that and leave it for Q&A and further discussion. So thank you very much for putting this on and for inviting me to participate.
It's Simi, and we'll be coming back to a number of points that you raised in your remarks. I'd like to kind of take a step back now and open up for panel discussion. First of all, was curious about the environmental impacts, and are there other impacts that we should be concerned about? Doug enumerated quite a few. One question, or one thing that I didn't quite hear in there, Doug mentioned debris. There's a lot of war rubble. What people don't realize is that a lot of these buildings have asbestos. And so it's not just a question of, getting out the bulldozer and push it into some vacant lot or whatever. That I'm wondering, are there other things that we need to be worrying about? Other priorities?
I think the carbon situation, if nothing else. Well, carbon and obviously the radiation. Just from the standpoint of carbon, when we talk about decarbonization and so forth, I know here in Chicago, one of the issues that comes up when we talk about policy development is the amount of carbon that is used in order to create a building of whatever sort. And even if said building is destroyed, then there's going to be a release of carbon there. And then, of course, when we talk about even the cleanup issues are the same as you would see in any urban situation environmentally. And when we try to rebuild, you're going to have the issue of the amount of carbon that's being used just to produce the steel, produce the materials and so forth. So at every level, there's going to be some issue, if not managed properly, there's going to be some issue of carbon releases. Now, as we're dealing with carbon releases, again, you're getting into greenhouse gases, you're getting into, well, like here in Chicago, you get into heat islands and so forth. If there's not enough greenery, you see all of these issues, just carbon alone. The radiation has been an issue directly already because one of the first moves that the Russians made, which is to me one of their original debacles, they went after Chernobyl, and it was they took it very, very easily. And I think that's one of those issues, like when you have an argument, there's a point you really don't want to defend, you just say, okay, that's pretty much what happened. It's like, why keep it? So yes, it's close to Kyiv, but why would you have that? And so even, as a chemical officer, if that came up in terms of planning with any senior leader, any infantry commander or anything like that, I would tell them immediately, this entire area is irradiated. So you would do that with any chemical. You would talk about that with radiation, and you will lose people just putting them in there. And so unless you just have this deep reserve of soldiers, that's going to cripple your operations. And of course, it did cripple them. And then even as they tried to move south, they were ambushed. So as a matter of environmental, just not paying attention to basic environmental issues, not paying attention to basic military issues, they fumbled the ball all the way. It's astounding how they fumbled this.
Thank you, Damon. Are there any other impacts that people wanted to flag?
Yeah, I think I may have missed one or two. I guess one we have seen is impact on critical civilian infrastructure. So in terms of energy being knocked out, but also in terms of water infrastructure. So for example, there's a water treatment plant close to the banks of the Dnieper, which was damaged. A day later, we saw what appeared to be a major discharge into the river from that treatment plant. So we've seen a lot of de-energization, we've seen damage to gas pipelines, we've seen fires at gas pipelines. So all of these fundamental bits of critical civilian infrastructure, including energy generation plants as well, which may contain PCBs, which have been damaged or destroyed. Each of these sort of nodes and parts of the civilian infrastructure can have a potential environmental impact when it's damaged, and not just through direct damage, but also through de-energization. When the power is knocked out, stuff stops working or starts malfunctioning.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on it related to what Doug's saying, actually, that there are going to be the consequences of not being able to respond to the disasters. So they're exacerbated. And then there's also questions that will come up. And I noticed in the Q&A, there were a number of questions about what a reparations process might look like. If there is due process, which we hope there will be, then there will be questions about what kind of mitigation Ukraine has provided, what kind of response it provided. And I would say from the limited experience we have of this kind of thing, there will probably be a kind of fog of war defense for Ukraine in not being able to take defensive responsive measures. But these are the kinds of complications that we'll get into.
And I'm wondering, in terms of infrastructure, do we have a sense of how much of the water infrastructure has been targeted?
I don't think we haven't seen clear overview data in the public domain. I would imagine Ukraine's Bureau of Emergency Responses, they are maintaining a list, and also the water companies as well. And it's been interesting in Eastern Ukraine, Voda Donbassa, who for the last 8 years have been providing water across a line of contact and have been running constant repairs due to ongoing damage and disruptions to the water facilities there. So there's depth of experience, certainly within parts of Eastern Ukraine, in managing the impacts of conflict on water systems there.
I think one of the things that comes to mind, a major issue, is the sinking of that flagship. You know, even when you take it back to December 7th, you know, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and sank so many U.S. ships, one of the problems that you see to this day was some of the oil or whatever that was coming up from one of the underwater ships. So with the attack, when you have any kind of warfare on water, obviously you're looking at sinking ships and whatever is in that ship, you know. And I'm going to go off on a limb and say there may have been some hazardous material on said ship, and said ship was on fire for a time. So you have all of that. It is now underwater. You know, how do we clean that up? What are our jurisdictional issues, that kind of thing. Doug, to your point, and Carl, to your original question, there was something that you made me think of when you talked about the attack on the industrial areas, and we see this here in Chicago as well. For one example, we had General Iron, which was a scrap metal recycler, who was trying to relocate from the north side to the south side of Chicago. And the big question there, as a scrap metal recycler, were the air emissions that were consequent of that. Now they break down cars, they break down any of your mechanical devices, you know, appliances and so forth. And so when it's working with the NAACP, when we did our research on, you know, the environmental impacts of that, you know, there are two things. And there's one, the obvious, you know, air emissions, breathing that, and what happens to you. But what we see in environmental justice situations is that there is oftentimes an increase or a greater lethality when it comes to COVID-related deaths and so forth. People in Black and brown communities tend to die more because they have some of the comorbidities from the very beginning, that respiratory comorbidities that COVID tends to exploit. So as this war progresses, as we have these air emissions, as we have the other forms of pollution, radiation, whatever else, that weakens the human body and attacks the respiratory system, when we're still in the middle of a pandemic, or if you want to call it endemic, whatever, but there's the pandemic in all of the sequence. You're going to see more of these issues come up. And so in addition to dealing with your traditional military casualties and so forth, you're going to see more of that. You're going to see some of the pollution fall in from their nearby rivers and so forth, you're going to see that pollution as those centers are being destroyed or attacked or so forth, and it falls into the water. Those are things you're going to see in the water as well. So it's going to be public health, it's going to be air emissions, it's going to be those the contaminated waters.
Thank you, Damon. Before turning over to Simi, there are a couple of additional comments that I wanted to flag for the panel. One is there any, or what do we know about depleted uranium use in Ukraine? And the other, do we have any sense of the environmental impacts related to the population displacement, such as damage caused by inadequate sewage or rubbish disposal? Simi.
Yeah, I was actually going to respond to Katerina's comment about displaced populations. So there's both displacement within Ukraine, and she's highlighted in the chat some of the issues, inadequate sewage, rubbish disposal, things like that, where people are being temporarily sheltered. There's also, which is important, and there's also the impacts on the countries that people have gone to the extent, I don't know exactly what the situation is and how people are being housed, but that's potentially another source of environmental damage. If water resources, sewage resources, land is being overstressed in the neighboring countries.
One of the concerns that I have about the displaced populations issue, environmentally, as people try to flee, you're seeing these long lines of vehicles and so forth. And obviously, just as in the United States, when you have these interstates that bisect communities and so forth, it increases the air pollution in the area. These long lines are going to obviously have their own emissions and that kind of thing. And that's going to be a huge problem. Another problem, as I'm recognizing it, is that there's been a lot of reports of racism in terms of even just trying to get out. And that's going to be a huge international problem if people don't really think about it. Reason being is that, well, one, as I talk about environmental justice and how that can be concentrated on a group of people, you're literally seeing that now, and it's playing out as an international version of blue lining, where you have a select group of people that are forced to remain in a particular area that is highly contaminated and highly genocidal. So, if you want to make any claims about genocide, you have to understand that whoever is being forced to stay there is now being forced to be in that situation, which creates, and again, a more internationalized version of environmental justice. So yeah, you're going to have your air emissions from just the cars trying to escape. You're going to have the EJ issue of people being forced to remain in that area. And of course, it becomes a greater problem because Ukraine is asking people for their assistance. So you have, for example, the African Union, which came out and said that to the United Nations and everything, and said that Russia needs to leave. But you're not seeing a galvanized response from the world to come out in support of Ukraine. And how could they? You have Indian citizens, students who can't get out. You have Nigerian students who can't get out. And so, with them asking for assistance and recognition of their humanity, while at the same time keeping people, being racist and keeping people inside of the borders, is going to cripple their ability to get that support that they need economically, militarily, politically. And so that can make this war drag on just a lot longer, and then amplify all of the environmental issues that we're talking
about. Doug, any final words on the environmental impacts before we shift gears a little?
Yeah, maybe just pitch on the question about DU. This is an interesting question for us. Russia has a number of generations of 125 millimeter anti-tank rounds made of depleted uranium. There are we know less about Russia's DU rounds than those of the US. We understand that there are a high degree of contaminants in Russian DU, which is used in their weapons. And we think it really warrants attention. We've seen a few photos of Russian weapon stocks that have been left behind, and we've been having a look at those to see if we can identify possible DU use. But I think at this stage in the conflict, we can't discount it. There's a military purpose, as far as the Russians would be concerned, for equipping their tanks with DU rounds. So it remains an open question whether they have been deploying them or not.
Thank you. So I wanted to take a step back. Why do we care about the environment? We see all these horrible photos coming out of Bucha and elsewhere, why are we talking about the environment here today?
I pitch in, and just because I've been asked the same question, we've been tweeted the same question of why are you talking about the environment when there's clearly a huge humanitarian crisis, which is true. But I think it's possible to maintain two thoughts in your head at one time. And I think particularly in the case of Ukraine, a lot of the environmental impacts we see have likely health risks for the civilian population. So it's not a question of focusing solely on the environment. When we're talking about the environment a lot of the time, we're talking about potential humanitarian risk, but also risks to livelihoods, to well-being, to resources which people rely on. So to sort of look at that question, you can't separate us out from the environment that we depend on in peacetime or in conflict.
All right. When we look at disasters around the world, just natural disasters, not even anything where somebody did something in particular. Natural disasters have as much or more of an impact on human life as any given war or battle. That's a major issue. You know, and we have got to figure out some kind of way to deal with that, because wars at least generally come to an end. Even the 100 Years' War at some point stopped, you know. But if we don't deal with climate issues today, particularly when we've already had, you know, our agreements about, you know, trying to avoid reaching 2 degrees and so forth, increase in climate and weather temperatures, you're looking at the environment is a longer term issue. So I guess if you want to look at it as more of something like in a movie, if a fight breaks out on a spaceship or something like that, the fight will end. But if the spaceship is destroyed, then not only does the fight end, all life on the entire spaceship is destroyed. You know, so this is a true. It brings us to an extinction level event in and of itself, just off of what we as humans are doing.
Thank you, Damon. Simi?
I'll leave it with Damon's words.
Stavros, do you have what do you say when somebody asks you why the heck are we talking about birds and bunnies here?
That's a great question. First, you know, usually I frame it as a double challenge problem. You know, if we see it from the wartime perspective, civilians, humans count more, which is understandable. So environmental protection is delegated to a lower level in the protection agenda. When you see it from the peacetime perspective, then again, environmental degradation, environmental pollution, or many issues we've been talking about usually are again relegated to a lower position as opposed to climate change mitigation, for example. This is usually how I frame it, a double challenge. It's very difficult to raise awareness for the problem of wartime environmental damage. And this, of course, should serve as an incentive for civil society, international community at large to try harder. So this is how I identify the problem. When it comes to environmental damage, then I definitely concur with what's been said about the existential threat, the life-supporting value of the environment, both for human and non-human species. The challenge would be, I think, something that also Simi mentioned before about environmental damage per se, the remediation of environmental damage per se as such. So let's assume that there is not any connection to humans. Would we still be willing to protect the environment, and how many resources would we be willing to invest in such a protection? Because after all, this is a self-referential issue. We are the humans with great power. We decide how to distribute resources and what value to attach to every single resource. We have this authority, in a sense, this power, but this, I think, should mean that we also have greater responsibility in affording protection to non-human species, to non-living organisms, including the natural environment. This is an abstract discussion, but I think it should also be translated in our actions. And as far as the legal side of things is concerned, the ILC, the International Commission, has done a great job in this. He's already adopted, at least on first reading, a principle explicitly mentioning that environmental damage per se is compensable, and at least from the legal standpoint, this is, I think, a vital, it's a pivotal point to start with. It should be the reference point.
Excellent. I want to come to, there are a number of questions and comments about what can we actually do. Before we get there, I'd like to just kind of do a bridge question. Of the various environmental impacts that we're talking about, which ones violate international law? And Simi?
I'll go for the easy one. Attacking a country that hasn't attacked you. It's a fundamental violation of customary international law, of the UN Charter that Russia is a party to. Russia is particularly egregious in this case in that it's a member of the Security Council whose primary role is to keep peace. I think it's worth noting, and I teach international environmental law in the spring, and I made my class explain to me what Russia claimed was the legal justification. And I think it is important to note that we may be very dismissive of Russia's justification, but there is still this desire to pay some obeisance to the idea of rule of law in even making an attempt to explain what a legal basis for Russia's attack may be. And it's kind of a responsibility to protect argument that they were saving Russian, ethnically Russian people living in Ukraine from genocide. There's no basis to believe that's true at all. There's absolutely no factual basis for it. But that is by being a breach of a treaty, it triggers state responsibility. And so again, I want to underscore this distinction I made at the beginning between international criminal law and international civil law, and sort of the different paths and the different remedies you can seek under each of those. So then Stavros and others can go down the road of the law of armed conflict.
So to be clear, in international law, we have the jus ad bellum, the kind of the law governing entry into war. And then we have the jus in bello, the law governing what happens during wartime. What you're talking about is the first body of law. And that's related to, that was the basis for holding Iraq liable for all environmental damage, not just certain damage that met certain thresholds in conventions. It violated the Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, and therefore Iraq was liable for all of the damages, environmental and otherwise.
That's right. And that's an important point that you make, Carl, because if that is the basis, depends on the source of the fund and the procedure, the kind of procedure for looking at reparations. But if that's the basis that's used, then it makes the whole case much easier for Ukraine, because then Iraq has to make affirmative defenses about what Ukraine should have done and so on. But
I want to wait on, anybody to answer before I said this part. There's obviously the Chemical Weapons Convention that we have to consider. I want to wait on that because that information is still being developed. Supposedly we don't know, and we haven't figured out for certain if chemical weapons were used at, say, Mariupol or elsewhere, that there are reported incidents of chemical weapons. If it is true that the weapons were used, then of course we're going to have to identify, what weapon, what substance, what have you. And that, if they were used, that would trigger, the convention itself. But again, just kind of stepping back on that, because right now it has not been confirmed, but once we have that information, then we'll know if a law has been broken, and if so, to what degree, and just go from there.
Thank you. Stavros, thoughts?
Yes, I totally agree with Simi about jus ad bellum legal reasoning. This is a blatant violation of the prohibition of the use of force. As you said, Carl, Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter and the respective customary international law. It seems that it's also an act of aggression with all the legal consequences attached to such qualification. But I would also like now to move to the jus in bello, some jus in bello issues. Before doing that, I would like to connect, what Simi said in this jus ad bellum prong with a question we received about the potential of another compensation commission, the creation of another compensation commission, and I think it is relevant to what you said so far. Of course, the establishment of UNCC was possible, and also its functioning, its operation, precisely because all environmental damage was linked to the illegal occupation and invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. But this was also possible because it happened via a Security Council resolution, which made things much easier for all those involved. And such a Security Council resolution is not forthcoming in our case, in this case, precisely because of the veto power that Russia enjoys. So this might complicate matters a bit, and I'm not sure how easy it would be to establish such a commission. Again, perhaps Simi could share, of course, your thoughts on this. She's an expert on this issue, but the circumstances back then, in my view at least, were exceptional. At the end of the Cold War, the promise of a liberal international legal order based on international cooperation, etc., which of course was followed by great disillusionment in the 2000s. But I think that was the spirit of the era, and I don't think we are in the same mood at this point of time. So I'm not sure about the prospects of such a commission being established again. Now turning to some jus in bello issues. As Doug also mentioned, many attacks have been reported on oil refineries, oil depots. For example, we also had the attack or the fighting close to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. There were also some incidents concerning the Chernobyl and the exclusion zone they are in, and the conduct of Russian military personnel. So if I had to single out some events, it seems that what happened in the Zaporizhia power plant would violate international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict as relating to its provisions about nuclear our generating stations, that they should not be targeted. This is based on the treaty provision, Article 56 of Additional Protocol 1. With the other attacks, for example, in oil depots and oil refineries, I'm a bit skeptical. I wouldn't take a very straightforward position, at least with facts we have at hand at the moment, because these attacks could be legal if they were targeting military objectives, and then the entire discussion revolves around this issue. To what extent these refineries, these objects qualify as military objectives? Because to the extent they do qualify as military objectives, they are targetable under the law on the conduct of hostilities. But of course, we also have some other provisions that have to be fulfilled, precautions in attack. And of course, the proportionality principle. So even if you target a military objective, the collateral damage, or to put it in the treaty's text word, the damage caused to a civilian property, civilian losses, all these combined should not be excessive as opposed to the definite military advantage anticipated from such an attack. So we need to know more so as to take a more direct position on these issues. But if I had to single out two events, what happened at the Zaporizhia power plant seems to fall afoul of the treaty prohibition as enshrined in Article 56 of Additional Protocol 1. And then when it comes to Chernobyl and the occupation of the zone there, it seems that the conduct of the Russian authorities therein, to the extent they qualify as an occupying force for the time they occupied this part of the territory, seems again to be in violation of the obligations that an occupying power has, which is one prong is to ensure the welfare of the civilian population and also the security of the area. So yeah, I just single out two events. For the rest, I think we don't have the necessary amount of information at the moment so as to take a straightforward position.
So what I'm, just to be clear, what I'm not hearing are the provisions on long-term, widespread, and severe damage to the environment. What we're talking about is the prohibitions on attacks on nuclear facilities, and it doesn't have to release it. It's just a simple attack generates responsibility. Indiscriminate attacks. I haven't heard anyone talk about objects indispensable to civilian populations.
Maybe just comment on that. I think, yeah, I think it's been this issue of kind of cascading effects, which we've seen that when we look at attacks on sites with dangerous forces, the law can be written in quite a straightforward and narrow way. Whereas actually what Zaporizhia and Chernobyl certainly highlighted was that in the wake of the attack on Zaporizhia, a lot of the talk was, well, you know, the reactors are surrounded by concrete, they're fairly safe, they're not the same design that they had at Chernobyl. Sure, it's a problem that there is a firefight in the car park of a nuclear power station, one with 6 reactors, but the focus was on the reactors itself. It didn't really look at these second order or cascading effects. And I think we saw with Chernobyl and also with Zaporizhia that nuclear power stations also need power. And the power was cut off due to damage to energy infrastructure, certainly around Chernobyl, and also there were concerns over the lines feeding Zaporizhia. Also at Zaporizhia, it's not just the reactors. There were over 3,000 spent fuel rods being stored in the open air, close to the perimeter of the site, close to where the firefight took place. These have been flagged as a security concern back in 2014, 2015, when they were 250 kilometers away from the front line. All of a sudden, the front line was in the car park of the nuclear power station. Sure, you wouldn't get a reactor meltdown from these spent fuel assemblies, but you would end up with significant radioactive contamination on the site of a nuclear power station with very little capacity to manage it, to clean up, because it's currently occupied and held by Russian forces. So there's I guess a fuzziness and complexity to these real life situations, which aren't necessarily particularly well reflected by the law. And the remarkable and astonishing scenes around Chernobyl and Zaporizhia really brought that to the fore, I felt.
So I'd like to shift gears to the final question before we really open up for audience Q&A. And that's, so what can we do about this? Is there any way to hold the people or institutions accountable? And Simi has kind of laid out two primary prongs of accountability, one being criminal, the other being civil liability. And I'm curious, given the challenges with going to the International Court of Justice or creating a new ad hoc tribunal through the Security Council where Russia has a veto, what are options that the world might consider?
I think legally, or no, not legally. I think that's been covered, semi-covered that. I think that the biggest limitation that we're dealing with is political, because using the United States, for example, when we talk about the Chemical Weapons Convention and the extent to which we may support it, the US, we tend to, depending upon our legislature, our Congress, may or may not be very much so amenable to being governed in any way by an international treaty. And so the extent to which we can be held accountable to an international treaty is going to be limited. Well, you take the United States, and that is our attitude. Several other countries have the same issues. So the extent to which we can do anything about it is going to be based on the political and economic power of whoever the person charged is. So if you take, it would have been a very different reaction, for example, if, say, one of the North African countries, Libya, okay? If Libya found a way to do this same invasion against Ukraine, same facts, it would be a different treatment altogether. This in a completely different political situation, a completely different economic situation, that people are more willing to do certain things to Libya and be less willing to do it with Russia. Because again, you have to look at everywhere Russia is. Russia isn't just, Russia is a major investor in much of the African continent. China, you have to think about where China fits in. China is a major investor in much of the African continent. They're a major investor in Latin America. And so to do anything, to have any level of enforcement, is going to require the international community. So the question is, what are the military, political, and economic ties the rest of the international community has with China and Russia? Because it's one thing to say Europe feels one way and NATO feels one way. Okay. But Europe and NATO is relatively small compared to planet Earth.
Yeah, I think so. Damon makes important political points, or the important point that the politics is going to be a challenge. I can make some suggestions about what might happen in a more optimal situation where there is political will, and it can range from, sort of national courts to international processes. But the way I look at it, where is there going to be money? How do you get a compensation fund in the first place? There's been a lot of talk about how the assets that have been frozen or might be found can be given away. The fact is, there are legal processes, and we have to respect the legal processes. So not all of those assets can just be handed over to Ukraine. It's going to depend on the national laws of each of the countries, which includes France, Germany, Japan. Of course, China holds major percentage of the assets, as well as the United States, to actually, what can they do under their law to use those resources? Let's say that we have access to some amount of that money. It could be used in two ways. One, depending on the national laws, it could be vested directly in claimants through national court processes. Two, it could be used, and there's a precedent for this, with the Iran U.S. Claims Tribunal as leverage. So to the owners of that private and public property, say, we're not going to give it back to you unless you agree to a reparations program, which this will partly fund, but you might get some of it back and you get due process then. That's the deal that was made after Iran's civil war, and the US had similarly frozen assets. And then there was a negotiated settlement that did not go through the Security Council. It was between the US and Iran. And that process actually created an arbitral type tribunal that's still sitting in The Hague because they're really slow. That was like 1970, but it did provide for a procedure. And then the third approach is maybe a standing international court, but it's much harder to imagine getting access to the assets to pay off. That's going to be much more subject to Russia's willingness to pay whatever is designated as what it owes. And that seems highly unlikely that they will agree. So
Wondering if there might be kind of a bifurcated analysis. There are the state assets that are frozen, and that appears to be on the order, at least in the U.S. alone, $100 billion. That's B with a billion with a B. And then there are the assets of private Russian individuals, often referred to as the oligarchs, and there may be other due process considerations that may make it harder to leverage those assets unless it's as you were describing. I'm just wondering if there's a distinction here in which assets we're talking about using.
Well, state assets for certain we know can be used. That's part of one of those things that we were looking at earlier. You can snatch these frozen state assets and use that for reparations. How you do it, I'll leave that alone. But can it be done? It can be done.
You do have to think about consequences. If the United States does that, the countries keep their resources here because we have a stable currency, and so it's safer for them. But if it starts looking like it's not safer because the United States government can arbitrarily seize the assets, that is a question. There's ultimately there are questions like that our hearts may say, well, this is justice, but as you said, Damon, there's politics too, and there's
Right.
long-term calculations about what's important. So
I wonder if anybody would comment on domestic criminal prosecutions using universal jurisdiction under the Rome Statute. My understanding is that some countries have domestically started investigations regarding war crimes, assertions, and so that doesn't provide compensation, but it may provide some measure of accountability if you can ever catch certain individuals.
that seems particularly difficult for environmental issues. The notion of universal jurisdiction is sort of closely associated with Jus Cogens crimes like genocide and crimes against humanity. And that's not how the environmental harm has been treated. And I'm not sure, I think in one of the questions, the issue of intent was raised as well. And it would be interesting, I don't actually know whether there is a basis to say that Russia has intentionally targeted the environment as such, which clearly Iraq did with the oil wells in Kuwait. So those might be factors in thinking about that, Carl.
That's going to be a major thing in and of itself, because I think that people are going to be very leery about opening certain Pandora's boxes, such as what could arguably be an unintentional exposure. Let's just say with Chernobyl, let's say that was an unintentional exposure to Ukraine of all the radiation. Now, you know, if we try to argue torts or something, we could say that that's reasonably foreseeable, but whatever, or we can stick with that. The United States has an issue because Joe Biden right now, President Biden right now is having to deal with the fact that there are outstanding lawsuits against the Department of Defense, against the United States, because of the American use of burn pits overseas. Those burn pits had all kinds of material in them, including depleted uranium. So even if it's a low grade amount, as supposedly DU is supposed to be a low grade amount of uranium, I don't want to be near it if I can help it. But you know, we use that in our armor. They use it over there. By us doing what we were doing, the United States created an entire environmental problem overseas. So if we bring that issue up and say, hey, you need to be prosecuted because you introduced this contamination that can cross borders, because again, Chernobyl is, given where it is, you know, it's right up on other borders. You know, the same argument could be used against the United States. And so does the United States really want to open itself up to that? And it's not just that, it's a lot of different either environmental, criminal, civil issues that if the United States goes off on a limb to prosecute certain things, then that's going to blow back on the United States and say, hey, are you also liable for the same under your logic?
Stavros, I want to come back to the comment from Damon, but Stavros, you've had your hand up for a bit.
Yes, thank you, Carl. Just a couple of remarks to what we said in the last minutes. I also see some future in domestic prosecutions, and perhaps, of course, most likely they will be based in universal jurisdiction. Now we're talking about criminal responsibility. On this occasion, perhaps there would be higher chances for a state that is not so much involved in military operations, because we wouldn't have such concerns, for example, like the US would have, that this would equally happen to us in future. This is just a thought. The second one is about the potential peace settlement. Such a peace settlement could include issues of reparations, and this has happened in the past. Same, of course, mentioned the Iran-US agreement, but also in the aftermath of Second World War. We are also familiar, I mean the international community, with this mode of addressing damage, including environmental damage. And then about environmental crimes or criminal activity, international crimes connected to environmental damage. Indeed, it seems that war crimes, the environment-specific war crime as enshrined in the International Criminal Court Statute will not be prosecuted, has not been so far, not even indicted. But if we go and have a look at the 2016 Office of the Prosecutor policy report, the policy paper of the ICC, we can see that one way, of course, is to prosecute this crime, the environment-specific war crime. The other way forward is to address, to examine, to investigate issues of environmental damage when an alleged perpetrator has committed international crimes by means of causing environmental damage. So on this occasion, the prosecutor will examine the underlying wrong, which can be, which for our purposes will be environmental damage that led to the commission or that contributed significantly to the commission, to the perpetration of an international crime. And this is how wartime environmental damage could fall within the purview of a prosecutor, either of the ICC or a domestic criminal prosecutor.
I'm wondering about another option. What happens if there is if Ukraine issues, or if there's a judgment in Ukraine, whether it's a civil judgment or a criminal prosecution, and then a request by Ukraine to relevant countries to enforce the judgment against Russia using assets that have been frozen. How would that work?
It's only as good as the extent that people want to participate. If you look, for example, towards the end of the whole conflict in Bosnia, we were dealing with war criminals there, right? A lot of those criminals were brought in simply because intelligence agencies and the special operations communities, both in England and the United States, not saying just us, but for sure us, they went and simply snatched the person that's a problem, whoever the target was. When we look at Osama bin Laden, now to your point, what if we're asking somebody to enforce things? Well, we were supposed to be partnered with Pakistan during the so-called global war on terror. And, for some reason, Pakistan did not enforce and bring us bin Laden. So we sent Navy SEALs and shot him. So that happened. So it's just a matter of to the extent to which you're going to enforce. Now, the question is, I just gave you the United States. Does Ukraine have that capacity? Ukraine did they did arrest somebody already that was close to Putin and decided to leverage him for trade for other prisoners and so forth. That can be done. The United States can, if we want, train people. U.S. Special Forces does this. We train people to do things. We trained some of the Colombians when they needed to deal with Pablo Escobar. The United States didn't directly kill him. We just trained the people to do it. So there are ways to get it done, to get it enforced, if somebody doesn't want to comply.
If there were to be a tribunal somewhere, whether it's a bilateral or a domestic tribunal, or even if there could be some sort of international tribunal, although it sounds that the panel's skeptical about the prospects of an international tribunal. Richard Wenning asks, what sort of evidence must be brought forward to argue for damages and define reparations? And I think the related question is, when do you start collecting that evidence, and how do you make sure that it will be admissible? Simi?
Now, which they're doing. It's crucially important. So once you get into a legal process, then you follow legal rules. And for the UNCC experience, which is the major model we have, it was very much like a natural resource damage claim in the US or in Europe. You need to show causation. You need to show what the baseline was. So what was the original condition of the thing that's held to be damaged? Remember, Ukraine is a heavily industrialized country that would have monitoring, but would also have pre-existing damage or damage from other sources that might be going on right now. So you have to show the distinction between that. So there's some complex evidence that needs to be collected. There are very particular ways that it needs to be collected because of the ability now we have not only to use like our phones, but the ability we have to manipulate the images that come from our phones. So there's, protocols on doing that. My understanding is that Ukraine is taking advice on that, and Ukraine has a sophisticated legal system for environment. They actually have a crime of ecocide in both Ukraine and Russia. So that they need to follow those kinds of procedures.
From the military standpoint, when I was a chemical officer, part of our training was to send, in terms of chemical reconnaissance, we were able to go into what's considered a hot zone, any contaminated area, and bring back samples for identification, so we could identify it there. But we would be able to pass that off to whatever other agency needed to have it in order to have a more formalized identification of that substance. Now, with that being said, we were basically, we're one of the science branches as far as the military is concerned, the Army. And so what we're going to be concerned with is whether or not that substance is still there. So to Simi's point, when she's saying immediately, absolutely. So for purposes of, say, a chemical weapons convention, if we're going to go in, investigate, and collect the data, the evidence, and know for certain that an event has happened and that the Russians caused it, it would require getting that information. But again, you're going to have to think about what the substance is, the persistence of said substance. You're going to have to think about the weather conditions that may keep it or get rid of it altogether and erase your evidence. So you're going to have people somewhere close who can very quickly and effectively and safely go and collect that information, collect that sample data to bring back, because otherwise, depending upon what the substance is, you can have a chemical attack and the evidence goes away, and then there's no prosecution whatsoever because technically it never happened.
Just to coming on the data question, so I suppose less about data collection for evidential purposes, but actually more about data collection for visibility purposes. So we're one of many organizations within and outside Ukraine who are gathering data. And I think this also speaks to the politics question, which we discussed earlier around chances of some kind of legal process or reparations process happening. On the one level, we've been really impressed with the degree of media interest in environmental issues in the context of this conflict. Part of that is because it's, the nature of the conflict, a Western white conflict, has had a lot of attention, full stop. But in addition to that, there's been a lot of data which we have been able to gather remotely around the conflict. And that's part of this wider trend around documenting human rights violations or abuses using social media and all the other tools we have at our disposal, satellite imagery, imagery or data on air quality gathered remotely, and also a lot of historical data as well on the nature of installations around Ukraine. I think this perhaps gives some hope. I think that as long as we can maintain this sort of high level of attention on the environmental narrative of the conflict, it makes what may come next considerably more likely. And in addition, there's a lot of work which can be done to support Ukraine at the moment in their data gathering and data collection. And I suppose just building on Simi's point as well about Ukraine's domestic environmental governance infrastructure, that they have a significant capacity of the Ministry of Environment to go and do sampling and data collection at these sites which have been targeted. So collectively, all these different sort of issues around data collection and visibility are probably a lot more promising than perhaps some of the historical conflicts which we've looked at.
I'd like to do a final tour de table with a question, specifically from Karen Holm. What do you think are the best options for securing responsibility and or reparations for Ukraine in relation to environmental damage caused by the conflict? So think about that for a moment. What are the best options? We've talked about all these different things. What are the best options? And I wanted to just highlight, there are some other things that need to be done, that can be done, that are not necessarily about the law, but more about environmental management in terms of doing a rapid environmental assessment, remediation, restoration, whether that's funded by seized assets, by bilateral contributions or whatever. There's a whole nother realm of activities on post-conflict environmental restoration that we're not talking about here. But kind of focusing on kind of what are the best options, like maybe go around in reverse order. I'll start with you, Simi. What are your favorite options for liability, responsibility?
Thanks, Carl. I think that, collecting the evidence and getting lots of support to Ukraine for collecting evidence, coordinating well so that people interested in helping aren't falling all over each other and making it look like a bad Agatha Christie where people are messing up the evidence because they're so eager to be there. I think then if there's a bunch of these strategies that can be used. Something with the frozen assets, I think, is the likeliest to yield results. But I actually want to mention one more possibility, which is even if there isn't sufficient money to actually undertake all the restoration, it may be worth creating a record of damage. And that's another thing that has been done. The International Court of Justice had the case of the damage caused by the construction of the wall in the occupied Palestinian territory. And what happened as a result of that was the UN Register of Damage was created. It could receive claims. So it at least creates the accounting. And so at least we know. So I don't think that, I think we must at least do that. We must tell the story of what's happened in Ukraine and take advantage of the legal processes we have at our disposal to do that in a convincing, objective, well-supported way. Thank you again so much for doing this webinar.
Thank you, Simi. Damon.
Other than seizing assets that we've talked about, it seems to me that when this thing is over, there's going to need to be a rebuild. And I don't see how that's going to be much different from the rebuild that was necessary for Europe generally at the close of World War II. So we're going to need, Ukraine is going to need a Marshall Plan. And I just don't see well, in any of the European Union, NATO, whatever, I just don't see anybody just letting that slide. Now, with that being said, just as here in the United States, we talk about how we want a Green New Deal, this would actually be the opportune time to develop a Green Marshall Plan, where we're taking some of the technology that we need in terms of decarbonization, solar, renewables, and so forth. One of the challenges that we have to getting this technology out is, whether or not we're actually reaching economies of scale. So with a Green Marshall Plan, we now have the ability to work with some of our small businesses, and I'm going to plug Chicago again, work with some of our small businesses, work with, say, Chicago Merc, who, they invest in futures and so forth. All kinds of creative ways to develop, these multilateral banks, to develop these green investment opportunities, to develop the science and technology, to develop the procedure to create steel at a low carbon manner, to create a negative footprint with buildings, to develop those techniques, those materials, and so forth, and use that to rebuild Ukraine. And as we learn how that works, and of course, we're hitting a certain mass, is dropping the price, and we can sell that across the world, and definitely in the United States. So that's going to be something that we're going to need, and we can potentially force the Russians to fund it. The way, because they're probably not going to participate, we would need international participation for the next part. If we start, like I said, Russia has been a major investor around the world, okay? Well, depending upon what people want to do, because this is an anarchic system fundamentally, the international community. If we seize their investments, change the title of ownership, and say, we own this now, we're not going to undermine the contract, but this is us. Ukraine has it, England has it, NATO has it, whoever wants to have it. And just divide up effectively, take all the Russian investments, divide it up and say, this is now going to fund the Green Marshall Plan. So it's going to be whether or not the United Nations will participate in it and The only way that I can see us getting that done is with the cooperation of other countries. And that's going to be a hard road, but that's the only one that I see, because otherwise you're just waiting on somebody to make something happen.
Stavros.
I see the merits of both positions. I would like to focus and perhaps expand on what Simi mentioned about the coordination and cooperation of various actors. There are different fora, at least at the international level right now. For example, the ICC, the Office of the Prosecutor, has expressed its willingness to start an investigation on the potential perpetration of international crimes, and they are collecting evidence. The same happens, and this seems to be a trend if we want to also see it from a broader perspective, a trend in international affairs. A commission of inquiry has been established by the United Nations Human Rights Council, and it seems that this is the way forward on many occasions when the international community has to deal with pariah states. So this can act as an evidence storage, an evidence bank. They collect evidence which can be further utilized in future prosecutions. They're not going to use it alone. This is not a tribunal or anything of this sort. They're just trying to establish the facts, and whoever in the future asks for this evidence, they will have it. So perhaps also coordination and cooperation under the auspices of this commission of inquiry. And then from a broader perspective and seeing things from the legal standpoint, you're right, Carl, I fully agree that now it's also about the post-conflict environmental assessment, rapid assessment, doing things on the ground, absolutely. Perhaps law at this point can be and should be relegated, should be pushed at the background. It should be about practical realities and how to deal with these burning needs. But this could also, I think it should be also institutionalized because this could serve as a precedent for future cases that inevitably will happen. So these are very welcome responses of these ideas, but it would be great if they could be institutionalized, if they could be translated in legal form so that they could serve as a guide for the future. Many thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Stavros. And Doug, you have the last word on this.
Oh, terrifying responsibility. I will maybe simply circle back to that question you asked at the start of why do we care about the environment? And I guess we've seen from this discussion that environmental protection is a protection of civilians issue. If we want to protect people in conflict, we need to protect the environment that they depend on. We're also interested in environment for norm development to try and strengthen norms around environmental protection. And we haven't talked a great deal about the International Law Commission's work, which concludes this year with a set of 28 or so draft principles, creating a new and improved normative framework around environmental protection before, during, and after conflicts. And the fact that this conflict has happened at a time where the ILC are literally meeting in a week or so in Geneva to thrash out the final text of these principles, it's a reminder to all the states involved and all the stakeholders of what's at stake if we don't get this right about strengthening this framework. I think we've also heard that we need to protect the environment for issue of reparations. And I think throughout all this, it'll needs a foundation of data collection and monitoring. And I think we're in a far better situation than we were 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago in terms of the visibility of the environment, but it's no longer this silent victim of conflict. As the old cliche goes, we can see it and we can ensure that this data gets fed into what happens next, whether it's scoping studies or post-conflict environmental assessments or whatever legal processes come out of it. I'll leave it there, I think. Thanks again.
Well, thank you all for a very illuminating discussion. It's been incredibly rich. I'm dropping in the chat a link for an event on Friday where we will have a number of speakers, including Jose Allen who was one of the UNCC environmental commissioners, so let me that's in the chat there. So Please, if this is of interest, if this topic is of interest, please join us Friday at noon Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Central European Time. I want to also do a specific shout out to the ILC, which has been working on this topic for more than a decade, is so close to finishing, and that is going to be an incredibly important set of principles on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict when they're finalized. So best of luck in that endeavor. And Madison, do you have a few final remarks?
Just a big thank you to everyone. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Carl, and thank you to the audience for all of your questions. I apologize we couldn't get to them all, but we really appreciate everyone's time. And there will be a recording of this posted to ELI's website in the next couple of days if you had colleagues who wanted to attend or you want to watch back later. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.